Greetings. My name is Jalandra A. Davis, otherwise known as Mommy Melusine. I am a writer, scholar, educator, dancer, mermaid enthusiast, and all around creative. Welcome to the Merwomanist podcast, where we talk about Black mermaid lore, fantasy, spirituality, and aquatic culture. Dive in and enjoy. Hello, and welcome back finally to the Merwomanist podcast with Mommy Melusine. It's been a few weeks that I have made, it actually hasn't been a few weeks that I've made an episode. I've actually been making an episode like every week for the last few weeks, but they are not up. I made an episode about mermaids and the election, talking mainly about the environment and climate change policy in relationship to the presidential election. I made this the night before the election, not the night before, but a couple of days before the election. And the morning after the election, when I saw the results, and it really sank into me that the United States has once again selected a fascist, racist, rapist, intent on destroying democracy as our nation's president, I took that episode down in a fit of despair because I felt like, what's the point? What's the point? I actually am somewhat regretting that now because I recorded that episode directly into the app, and so I don't have it anymore. I also was just uncomfortable with just a few things in that episode. When I talk about serious issues like political issues or elections, I really want to make sure I'm getting everything right and completely accurate. And there were just a couple things in there that I wasn't super comfortable about, and especially seeing the results and the way things turned out. I think it's just really important that those of us who are speaking publicly about these issues are absolutely on our P's and Q's and make sure that everything you say is something you can stand by 100% and have the data for 100%, right? Not that data or truth matters in the Trump nation, in the Trump world, but there are things that are important to me and that I think about if I'm ever going to sort of go beyond talking about fantasy or things like that on this podcast. So I ended up taking that episode down, even though quite a few people had listened to it. So I'm sorry about that. And I actually have recorded 2 episodes since then talking about my feelings about the election and their relationship to the kind of the work that I do. And both times I did not record the audio, or I was using a microphone that I just think isn't working anymore. So the audio didn't get recorded either time. And so I decided that it's really looking like it is not meant to be for me to talk about this election in a public forum in the way I'm feeling about it. I really went into a deep state of grief. I think the first time that Trump won, I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't imagine it would be any worse than your ordinary Republican presidency. And sometimes the Democratic presidencies aren't super kind to Black folks either. So I didn't expect things to unfold to the extent that they did. And now we really know. We really know well, I don't know that everyone knows, but I know as a critical ethnic studies scholar, as a Black studies scholar, as someone who studies history, as someone who knows what the signs of fascism, of an authoritarian government being driven by eugenics and racism, knowing what that looks like and knowing that we're approaching that and knowing the people I care about and the communities I care about who are incredibly vulnerable and who are going to suffer. It was just hard. It was just hard. So I've had a hard time kind of getting back on track and getting back to work and just moving things forward in my own life because I had to process. I'm on social media probably more than I should be. And some of the things that I've noticed is that everyone's sort of living all their stages. My corner of social media is very radical left politics, right? So everyone is kind of living their grief, the different stages of grief, the anger, the denial, the bargaining, the analysis. Everyone's sort of living all of that out loud. And I think that there are some who've raised some important points about the value of living those emotions out loud for people. Like, what kind of panic and harm could you potentially be producing if you're sharing in the interests of venting rather than progressing and moving forward? So, yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that. So, I have been recording episodes, but it just wasn't meant to be for them to be out there. So this is going to be quick because I need to get to my belly dance class because I'm trying to get back on track with my self-care, my fitness, and everything. So I'm going to have to get through this episode pretty quickly, but I just wanted to continue with my Mertober, even though we're in November now, but I usually end up extending my Black horror series into November because I never finish all the things that I want to talk about in October. So I'm not quite finished with my reading for Blackoween. So I am going to do another episode with a wrap up of the rest of the things that I read for my sort of Black horror focus that I do in October and November. But I did want to talk about a couple of mermaid horror films. There's only so many Black mermaid films of any kind. But I wanted to talk about a couple of mermaid horror films. I haven't really talked about mermaid stuff so much on the podcast lately, and my audience is here for the mermaids. So I wanted to talk about mermaid horror films. So if you are interested in mermaid horror films, I am going to link some previous episodes where I count down through some of my favorite mermaid horror films and also take a closer look at some of them. Today, I'm going to talk about two that I was aware of at the time that I did the Black Mermaid horror film wrap up last year, but that I hadn't seen yet. And that is Dagon. Oh, I don't have the year that this one came out, but this is an older film. I feel like it was 1990s, but Dagon, it's a Spanish film by Stuart Gordon, and She Creature, which is a 2001 film directed by Sebastian Gutierrez. So I'm going to start with Dagon. Dagon is is it an adaptation? I'm teaching a course on literary adaptations coming up in the spring, and it really has me thinking a lot about what defines the adaptation, what defines a retelling. I would say that Dagon is an original story that is loosely adapted from two short stories by H.P. Lovecraft that are part of his Cthulhu mythos, which is this mythos of these oceanic, like sea monster creatures, ancient civilization that humanity comes to see as gods, but that Lovecraft refers to as just a different kind of like consciousness. And so there are various forms that these creatures take. There's the Cthulhu, which is this like huge, massive monster, which is combined of all of these different kinds of creatures. So it's like an octopus and a dragon, and all of these things sort of put together. And there are also these like frog-like fish amphibious kinds of sea creatures as well. This is not a good explanation. I'm ashamed to admit this as a fantasy and horror scholar, but I'm just kind of just getting into Lovecraft. I have avoided Lovecraft. I mean, there was some stuff I had to read in school, but I've sort of avoided Lovecraft, sort of notorious for racism. And a lot of my white male students love Lovecraft and are always very upset that I don't teach him. And so I think it's created a little bit of resistance for me. However, this is a really, really important author to engage with if you are working in fantasy and horror studies, because the Cthulhu mythos and the larger Lovecraftian mythos is a universe that lots of people play in, and is really kind of the source for a lot of our imagery, a lot of recurring imagery and tropes and themes in fantasy and science fiction. One of the things that Lovecraft encouraged people to do, even when he was publishing back in like the early through the mid 20th century, is he encouraged other authors to play in his universe, like to create stories within his universe. So the work is incredibly influential on so many people in horror and fantasy. So I'm actually just taught Dagon and The Shadow of Innsmouth, which are the main short stories that this movie is inspired by, in my mermaids class, and I'm working my way through H.P. Lovecraft's catalog right now, which of course the work and the world building is brilliant, but the racism, even though it's not always direct, it does come through. And I also find the writing a little dry and dull. So it's been a process learning my Lovecraft, but it's a necessary. Anyway, Dagon, the movie Dagon is based on two of Lovecraft's short stories. The first one is about a veteran. This story comes out in like 1917. So I guess this is somebody who's coming back from World War One, and he gets stuck somewhere in the Pacific. And somehow he wakes up and like the ocean is drained, and he's basically at the bottom of the ocean on the seafloor. And he sees this obelisk, this like monument with sketchings from this ancient ocean civilization. And he sees this like terrible amphibious kind of man-like but not quite human sea creature, and it just terrifies him for the rest of his life, and he ends up depressed. Does he die at the end? He ends up very depressed, and I feel like he dies like of insanity or alcoholism. I don't remember exactly. He ends up dying, right? Just from the memory of this hideous creature. And so Craft continues to sort of develop the mythos of this sort of undersea world and these creatures. And we see a more developed version of that in the short story, The Shadow over Innsmouth, or the novella, because it's a little bit longer of a short story, which was published in early 1930s. I'm going to say 1930s is what I remember. And it is about this young man, I think he's an anthropologist, scholar of some kind, colonial scholar of some kind, right? Who he's exploring this town and notices there's something really strange about the people. They all have really waxy skin, they have strange, super bright eyes. There's something strange about them, and eventually comes to realize that they are hybrids and they have been mating for years with these kinds of sea creatures. So they've like given up their humanity. And the story is pretty clearly a racist, very eugenics feeling metaphor for miscegenation. And miscegenation is a now archaic term and an offensive term that was used to describe the mixture of races at the time that this was illegal, right, in the United States, which this was illegal up until the 1960s, actually, with Loving versus Virginia, which is one of the many laws that we might, well, actually, Clarence Thomas ain't going to overturn Loving versus Virginia because his wife is white. But that statute, right, that rules that interracial marriage is now legal is one of the many things that are possible to be overturned in a Trump America. Sorry, I can't just get it completely out of my head. I can't get it completely out of my head. Okay, so yes, this story is a metaphor for miscegenation. So the film had kind of a unique challenge in adapting these Lovecraft stories without also adapting the sort of racism and miscegenation. I think one of the ways that the director, the writers sort of avoid those themes is by moving it from a town, from an American town, which to me clearly kind of hinted at people of Southern European, Eastern European ancestry, the original town and the original story, because there was a time when even people who we now think of as white coming from Southern and Eastern Europe were not considered quite to be white by the sort of white Anglo-Western, the descendants of Western and Northern Europeans in the United States. So these immigrants were not necessarily considered to be quite white. They got some privileges of whiteness in terms of citizenship, but they weren't considered to be quite culturally white, and they were considered to be of lower stock and lower breeding. So the eugenics discourse, which eugenics is the idea that you can improve the racial quality of people through careful and intentional breeding. This eugenics discourse was not only used against Black people and other people of color, it was also used against not quite, I come spicy white, right? The spicy white or not quite white people, such as Italians, Polish, Jewish people at some point. But I think the difference with white people was it was thought to be that white immigrants or white people from these more undesirable areas could put like breed their way and be socialized into proper whiteness. And this wasn't something that was considered to be possible for Black people or for Asian people during the 19th century through the early 20th, early early, almost up until the mid 20th century, that eugenics was still really popular in the United States. The eugenics movement, okay, I'm going into professor mode here. The eugenics movement was actually the inspiration for Nazi, or Hitler actually was deeply inspired by and an admirer of the United States, of Jim Crow segregation, of the eugenics movement. He learned a lot from the eugenics in the United States, who were experimenting with how to breed people. They were castrating disabled people and people of color. They had all these experiments they were trying about how to reduce undesirable people and produce more desirable people. And this was actually something that Hitler and the Nazis were very impressed by. And they put these same strategies and these same methods into effect in World War II and in the Holocaust. And so, because of the Holocaust, United States eugenicists started to sort of distance themselves from the movement. And they moved into a different form of racism, which was more of a cultural racism, right? So instead of talking about genetic inferiority, they started talking about cultural inferiority. So they didn't stop being racist, but when the kinds of methods they had created as part of their racism resulted in the Holocaust and the murder of millions of Jewish people, and there were also Black people, gay people, Romani people were also murdered during the Holocaust, but I don't think the people in the US really cared about that, right? So they distanced themselves from this movement. I am so off. I'm not off topic. The eugenics movement is important context for understanding the shadow of Innsmouth, of this short story that inspires this film. However, the film attempts to distance itself from the eugenics movement by moving the story away from the United States. The director's also Spanish, and it's also a Spanish production, all the actors, right? So that's another reason for it. But I think that moving it to Europe helps to distance it from that sort of eugenics legacy. So it's just a Spanish town, this Spanish town, and they are struggling with their harvest. They're not getting as many fish. People are hungry. They're not making money. And this is a Catholic town. And there is a guy, I don't remember, he was a ship captain. I don't remember where he came from, if he always lived there. But this guy started trying to persuade them to pray to Dagon, to pray to the god Dagon in order to find good fortune. So I think he finally convinces them to perform a ceremony to Dagon or something. He convinces some people to worship this god of the sea. And not only do the fishermen capture all these fish into their nets, but they also capture gold, all of these gold idols and gold symbols. And so eventually, the Dagon faction takes over the town. They murder the priests. They tear down all of the churches, the images of Mary, Christ, all of that, and they put up Dagon in its place, and they start worshiping this god, and they start committing human sacrifices, like sacrificing people to this being. And eventually they start. In the film, it's not entirely clear. In the short story, it's really clear that they are like genetically mixing with these creatures, like they're having sex with these creatures and having children. What it looks like is happening in the film is that women are being offered up to the god, and then they are then mothering these children. But it also looks like people who started out as human can also sort of transform into these hybrids. So by the time our main characters, which is a young couple, and they're like dot-com billionaires, I think, like a dot-com billionaire and his girlfriend. I don't remember the guy's name, but I remember the girlfriend's name. Her name is Barbara. By the time they end up sort of crash landing on this island, there are almost no human beings left. All of the people are these hybrid, amphibious people, cannibalistic people. And so from there, chaos ensues. I'm not going to give away too much of what happens, but it is a pretty gruesome horror movie. It's interesting because at first it's not. At first, the movie was kind of goofy to me. It's a lower budget film, all natural effects. To me, it wasn't scary for like the first two thirds of the film. And then all of a sudden, it gets It's really horrible. And I don't know how much I can talk about how horrible it gets without giving away plot points. But I did mention that this guy crash lands on this island with his girlfriend, and that one of the things that these people do is they find human women that they can sacrifice as brides to this being, and the being looks like the Cthulhu, like it's like this tentacled, monstrous kind of being once it shows itself. So women are sacrificed to this being in order for them to bear the children. So you would just imagine, right? Like use your imagination. There is some pretty gory and disturbing violence, not only against women, but there's some gory and disturbing sexualized violence against women in particular in this film. So it's just something to be aware of because it was not pretty. Where's the mermaid? Where's the mermaid in the film? So there is a mermaid. The Dagon has a daughter, and she seems to be kind of like the princess of the town, like the sort of leader. Like everyone respects her. They do what she says. And she sets her sight. I can't remember the guy's name. The protagonist, I don't remember his name, but she sets her sight on, just as Dagon sets his sights on Barbara to be his bride, this mermaid, and I don't remember her character's name either, she sets her sight on the young man to be her groom, right? To be her husband. And she first appears in the movie as a more typical mermaid, like he dreams about her, he dreams about a mermaid. But by the end of the movie, she shows a different form, a different kind of form. And I won't spoil it, but it's a different take on a mermaid. Still the upper half, lower half, but the way the lower half looks is different, and it allows for different kinds of sexual and reproductive possibilities than what you get with a mermaid tail. I'll leave that there because I feel like that moment that you see her form is supposed to be a surprise, and there might be someone who wants to watch this. So this is streaming on Amazon Prime, and that's how I watched it. It was a wild time. It did get really gory at a certain point, but it was good. It was pretty good. Okay, so the other horror mermaid film, and I only have a few minutes to talk about this because I got to get out of here, but it is She Creature by Sebastian Gutierrez, and it came out in 2001. I'm so mad that now this film is streaming because back when I first wanted to talk about it, I couldn't find it and I ordered the DVD. The quality was very bad. And so for the majority of the movie, I kind of felt like I couldn't see much or see anything. And I didn't have time to rewatch it on streaming. It's now streaming on Amazon Prime, but I did not have time to rewatch it before recording this. But She Creature is a pretty straightforward siren monster movie. It's definitely the siren idea of the mermaid. She is so there. What do I want to say plot wise? You have this guy who's kind of a scammer, a trickster. He has like a circus situation and he is exhibiting his wife as a mermaid. So she's playing like she's a mermaid, she's singing, she has her tail on. This old man comes to see her because he thinks he's going to come see a real mermaid. And he's disappointed when he finds out she's not real. But they end up kind of forming a connection with this old man, and he reveals that he has a mermaid. He has a real mermaid, right? That he is keeping captive in the basement of his home. And he warns them that you can't play with mermaids because they're dangerous. This mermaid actually killed his wife. So, of course, the scammer protagonist boyfriend, of course, he steals the mermaid, right? He steals the mermaid. And the majority of the film takes place on a ship journey that they take in order to try to take her back to wherever they're going, where they're going to try to sell her or make money off of her. But this mermaid is dangerous, and the form of a mermaid is not her only form. She can also take fully human form, and she can also take another form, which is the form that she takes when she actually feeds on people, because of course she feeds on and eats men, right? So yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I didn't feel like there were any surprises in this movie. It definitely follows the siren monstrous movie siren tradition where the beautiful mermaid is actually a facade and the true form is something that is beastly and monstrous and predatory. But there also, I think the most interesting about thing about the film is the connection that the woman forms to her, and I'm sorry, I didn't get none of these characters' names. But the connection that the woman forms with her is interesting. Like the mermaid becomes kind of a protector for her, and her interactions with the mermaid and her attempts to communicate with her husband about the danger of the mermaid and why they need to release her, why they need to let her go. It really highlights themes of patriarchy, themes of sexual violence. It really highlights those kinds of themes that are often present in mermaid stories. So, what else can I say without giving away what happens at the end? I can't say too much more. I can't say too much more without giving away what happens at the end, even though I feel like you might be able to predict it. But it was fun. It was a fun as far as the ranking of these horror mermaid films that I've watched. I think I'd put it somewhere near the top half, right? So yeah, I recommend checking it out, and apparently it is now streaming on Amazon Prime. I sound like a commercial. So that is my Black Mermaid horror wrap up. I hope this makes sense to people who listen to it, and that you also learned a lot about eugenics and US history, because we are living that history again, and that's all I'm going to say about that. See you next time on the Merwomanist podcast. You have just listened to the Merwomanist podcast with Mommy Melusine. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, I would love 5 stars, and subscribe for future episodes. You can follow me on Instagram at Mommy, that's MAMI, _Melusine, or at Merwomanist Podcast, on LinkedIn at Jalandra Davis, or my website, jalandradavis.com. Wishing you love and laughter and hoping to see you swim this way again.